Welcome to Mercenta Tutorials. Mercenta is an innovative, secure, and easy-to-use platform that empowers sourcing teams to deliver breakthrough results for their organizations. I'm William, and I'll be your instructor today. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to configure your portal as the organization administrator. In today's tutorial, I'll give you an overview of the tasks that you will need to complete as part of your role as the administrator of your organization. The first thing that we'll do is to review the basic data which was set up when your organization was registered on Mercenta. The most important and critical item that you may have to change is the subdomain. I'll explain the effects that such a change will have on your users and your selected identity provider. Next, we'll turn our attention to perhaps the most important role of the organization administrator, security. There are two aspects of security that are critically interlinked: authentication and authorization. I'll cover authentication first, since it's the foundation for everything. I'll outline the options that you have and the implications that these choices will have on your security and user experience. Once we identify the user, we next need to determine what they can do in Mercenta, which brings us to the topic of authorization. I'll explain how authorization works and show you how to configure the authorization system to grant or revoke access to resources. There are three topics that we won't discuss today: themes, billing, and data storage. These features haven't yet been released yet in this beta version, but I'll keep them here as placeholders for the future. Themes will allow you to customize the look of your portal to match your corporate style. Billing is obviously not needed in the beta release. Data storage is a feature which will allow your organization to change the location of your database to your own cloud provider or on premises. Stay tuned. With the important topic of security behind us, I'll next focus on the final task that an administrator needs to do: bootstrap their organization by creating the users that will do the real work. I'll explain the key differences between a user and an administrator, and then we'll put this theory into practice by creating our first user. Unless you decide to do this yourself, the user that you will initially need to create is a human resource role, whose job will be to set up your organization's companies, jobs, teams, and users. And since no discussion on users and security can be covered without raising corporate governance, I'll provide an overview of some of the risks and the actions you can take to protect your organization by separating roles and responsibilities. Before we get started, make sure that you've registered your organization on our marketing website. If you haven't already and you need help, we have a tutorial on registering your organization on this channel. Once registered, you should have received a welcome email from Mercenta with a temporary password. If this isn't the case 2 hours after registering, then contact us at support@mercenta.com. Once the welcome email is received, you should sign in to the admin portal located at admin.mercenta.com and set up a new password. You should also be familiar with Mercenta's user interface. It's quite intuitive, but if you need any help, we have also uploaded a tutorial titled "How to Use the Mercenta Portal" on this channel. Finally, if you wish to follow along and want to test external authentication, then you'll need to set up a free trial account on Okta or any other identity provider. I've provided a link in the description and some details on the required settings. Now that we've signed in, let's go ahead and change our organization's basic data. You'll note that we've landed on the home page and that we're currently running version 0.7 of the software, and that this is a preview or beta release. We are constantly adding new features and will try to keep these tutorials up to date, especially if there are any significant changes. But you may notice some small cosmetic variations in your version. As the organization administrator, I'll only be using the organization module. And in fact, by default, I don't have access to the other areas of the application. Click Organization from the main menu. When the Organization menu loads, notice the Configuration section located in the center of the menu. This is the area that I am mostly concerned with. Let's view our organization's basic data by clicking the menu item in the Configuration section. Once the form loads, I see that the subdomain is wrong. I'll fix that now. And then click Save to save my changes. Changing the subdomain now doesn't have any risks because we haven't yet added any users. But if you do have users, you will need to inform them so they can find their portal. You may also need to update your identity provider settings depending on the options you select for authentication. At this moment we haven't yet configured authentication, that's the subject of the next topic, so this is the best time to change the subdomain. If you're using your own identity provider, changing the subdomain will affect your callback URLs, which you'll need to update at the same time. If you're using Mercenta's own provider, we'll update the callback settings for you automatically. Knowing who we are interacting with is obviously of critical importance to Mercenta. Authentication is the two-part process of validating an identity and then connecting that identity to a Mercenta user. Let's first talk about identity, then the validation process, and finally how we connect that identity to a user. While the concepts here apply to both users and administrators, this slide is only concerned with users. Administrators are authenticated using Mercenta's own provider and are not configurable by the organization administrator. In software terms, identity refers, quite arcanely, to the information about an entity used to represent a person. The entity that maintains a person's identity data and verifies a person's identity, which is known as signing in or logging in, is handled by an identity provider or IDP. The identity provider implements various authentication standards which specify the precise authentication workflow. The best practice is currently the OpenID Connect standard, which we've implemented fully. I've added a link to the website for the OpenID Foundation, which manages the standard. OpenID Connect is used by literally billions of websites around the world and used to secure highly sensitive government, financial and medical web assets. Your organization is probably using this standard already. This standard is highly secure and constantly evolving to stay ahead of new threats. Since identity providers perform a highly complex and specialized role, we have made the decision to outsource the IDP function to third parties. When setting up your portal, you will need to decide whether to use Mercenta's own, internal, or your own external provider, of which there are hundreds of choices. The most common in the market are Okta, AWS Cognito, Microsoft Identity, Ping, and many more. In fact, Mercenta's own internal provider is outsourced to Amazon AWS Cognito. I've provided a link to these in the description. Another option is to run your own IDP on your own premises or cloud. Initially, we recommend that you use our provider, and then in the second phase, migrate to your own. Using your own provider gives you full control over the branding, password policies, user configuration, single sign-on, and multi-factor authentication. The benefit in using our internal provider is that we automatically synchronize changes between Mercenta and the IDP. This means administrative tasks, like changing subdomains, adding and deleting users, and resetting passwords can be done from Mercenta. In this beta release, we have not yet added the feature to manage external IDPs. You will need to do all these tasks manually in your IDP's portal. When a user navigates to their portal, Mercenta redirects the user to your selected identity provider. Regardless of whether your organization is using an internal or external provider, the IDP will attempt to authenticate the user. If authentication is successful, the IDP returns an identity token to the user's browser, which is then attached to every subsequent request to Mercenta's backend services. When our services receive a request, we validate the token against your identity provider and then extract the identity's unique identifier, which is called the subject. We use the subject to link the IDP's identity to a Mercenta user. Our tutorial on user management on this channel goes into a lot more detail about how this works. Let's head back to the portal and continue where we left off at the organization main menu. In this demonstration, I'll configure authentication for our organization so that our users can sign in. To find the authentication options from the main menu, click Security. When the security menu loads, you'll see that this menu is divided into two sections. A section for authentication, which we'll talk about now, and a section for authorization, which we'll talk about later. Click the Identity Provider menu item in the Authentication section. When the form loads, you'll see the two options we discussed earlier, but by default, no identity provider is selected. Although we can create users, they will not be yet able to sign in. Let's talk about the third option first, which is to use an external IDP. For this demonstration, I'm going to use Okta, which is a well-known identity provider. I've logged into their website and set up an account. They have provided me with an authority URL and a client ID, which I'm inputting now. Once we input the authority, Okta will send various options to allow us to choose the response type and scope. For the response type, I'm going to select code, which is short for Code plus PKCE. This is the most secure authentication flow and therefore the only option we currently recommend. Then I'll select OpenID and offline access for the scopes. Offline access means that Okta will automatically renew the token when it expires, which is in about 1 hour by default. We do this so that our users won't have to keep logging in every hour. When I'm finished, I'll click the Save button to save my changes. When our users navigate to our portal, Mercenta will automatically redirect to Okta for sign-in. But for this demonstration, I'm actually going to use Mercenta's own identity provider. I recommend starting with ours first for initial trials and then migrating to your own later when you want to further customize your authentication options. Authorization is a security mechanism used to determine access to Mercenta's resources. A resource is authorized for a user when all of a resource's permission and scope requirements are satisfied. In Mercenta, there are 2 types of resources, queries and commands. Queries provide the user with the ability to view the named resource, whereas commands allow the user to change the named resource. For example, company detail query and rename company command. The former is a detailed view of a company and the latter renames a company. A scope requirement necessitates that the user has a certain relationship with a resource. These relationships are usually preceded by, is a member of, or is appointed to. In most cases, scopes are gained implicitly without any intervention. For example, almost every resource in Mercenta requires an organization scope. This scope requires that the user is a member of an organization and is gained implicitly when its account exists within an organization. Scopes may also be gained explicitly. For example, to gain access to a proposal, a user needs to be nominated as a contributor. To do this, the user would need to be added to the proposal's contributors list. A permission, on the other hand, is a distinct grant of authority to access a resource. We might also refer to this as a privilege. Following from the examples earlier, there would be distinct permissions associated with company detail query and the rename company command. Granting these permissions to a user, assuming of course that they meet all the other scope requirements, would grant them authority to view the company's details and rename the company. Permissions are defined by the developers of Mercenta and are finely grained. This means there are literally hundreds of permissions. For this reason, we generally group permissions together in 2 permission sets. Another reason is that many permissions need to go together. For example, if you grant a user permission to delete a company, then they will also need permission to view the company list. In other words, without one, the other is impossible. In this case, we'd define a permission set which combines these 2 permissions. When an organization is registered, we copy across a set of predefined permission sets. If you're so authorized, you're free to modify or remove these predefined permission sets, or even create your own. Let's head back to the portal and continue where we left off at the security menu. In this demonstration, I'll show you how to set up and maintain your organization's authorization system. When you registered your organization, we copied all our system permissions that your organization is likely to need to your organization permission list. This list can be viewed by clicking the Permissions menu item under the Authorization section. If you want to prevent your organization from using any of these permissions, you can remove them from this list. Let's say we don't want anyone ever to create or remove subsidiaries from our organization. Search and select the Create Subsidiary and Remove Subsidiary commands. Then click the cross icon to the right of the search bar. When you remove a permission from your organization, they are removed everywhere they are used. This includes where they have been directly granted to users and where they are used in permission sets. This action is irreversible, so use this feature with caution. You may add system permissions to our organization by clicking the plus icon to the right of the search bar, and then selecting the permissions that you would like to add. Then click the Add button. As new features are rolled out, we may add new system permissions that you may need to copy to your organization. In this case, we will contact the organization administrators to make them aware of the new feature and its associated permissions. You would add them using the same process shown here. Moving on to permission sets, you'll notice that we've also provided your organization with a long list of pre-configured permission sets. These permission sets package up discrete tasks which you can grant to your users to authorize them to perform their roles. They are yours to be modified as you wish, but we don't recommend that you play around with them in the early stages, at least until you know what you're doing. But just to show you how it's done, however, I'll modify an existing permission set. Search and then click for the Agreement Viewer permission set and rename it to Contract Viewer. Then we'll update the description. Then I'll click the Save button to save my changes. We can also add and remove permissions, and it will affect all users that use this permission set. I won't do that now because you've seen me do that before. Once you become more familiar with Mercenta, a far better approach to changing the existing permission sets is to create your own, which better suits your organization's requirements. For example, you may wish to have a permission set which better suits a role in your organization, such as a commodity buyer. To show you how it's done, I'll create a new permission set now. Click the plus icon to the right of the permission set section. Then fill in a unique name and description. Then click the Save button to save your changes. Now that the new permission set is created, I'm going to add permissions. Click the plus icon to the right of the search bar. Then select the permissions that we need. And click the Add button. Then click the Save button to save my changes. This permission set is now ready to be granted to users. To remove a permission set, scroll down to the bottom of the form, and then click the Delete button. And then confirm your decision. This permission set will be automatically revoked from all users. Now that we've completed the security section, I'll take a brief look at users. As the organization administrator, your role will be to bootstrap your organization by creating the users that will be responsible for managing the other users in the organization. I recommend that after you've done that, you revoke your own user management permission sets because you won't need them anymore. A user is a person who uses Mercenta software. I make this obvious statement to distinguish users from administrators who are responsible for configuring their portal and are not supposed to be using most of the features of Mercenta. Administrators have some access to the organization module, but no access to the other areas of the application. Users access Mercenta through the organization's custom portal, which is configured by their organization administrator. For this tutorial, our administrator has set up a portal located at mercury.mercenta.com. Administrators, on the other hand, only access Mercenta through the admin portal, located at admin.mercenta.com. Users authenticate using the identity provider chosen by the organization administrator. Administrators, on the other hand, are authenticated through the identity provider chosen and configured by Mercenta's system administrator. Users are already covered comprehensively in our tutorial titled User Management on this channel, so I won't go into any more detail here. For the final topic in this tutorial, I'll provide an overview of some of the corporate governance issues that might arise when managing users and administrators, and any mitigating actions you can take to protect your organization. My comments here are by no means exhaustive, but serve as a starting point for your own risk analysis. I've already covered this topic in the Managing Users tutorial, but I'll add a few comments here, specifically looking at administrators. Firstly, Mercenta includes some built-in corporate governance protections around the areas that we can control, such as preventing administrators setting passwords for others, preventing users accessing administrator accounts, preventing an administrator from granting permissions to themselves, and preventing administrators from accessing inappropriate areas of the application. Mercenta only allows the system administrator to create organization administrators, but this does not prevent a bad actor creating a new user account, which they can access, and then granting permissions to that user. The organization administrator is initially granted this authority because they need to bootstrap their organization. I recommend that they immediately revoke this authority once the initial users have been created. Finally, the identity provider should be controlled by the organization. Using Mercenta's own internal provider should be considered a medium-term measure, and ultimately the goal should be to move to an external provider where the organization has full control. Let's head back to the portal where I'll continue where we left off at the organization main menu. Users and administrators are located in the Modules section near the bottom of the menu. As we discussed previously, we'll add the 2 users who will be responsible for bootstrapping our organization. The first user will be creating our companies, teams, users and jobs, and the second user will be responsible for authorizing users to perform their roles. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this demonstration because we have a very comprehensive tutorial on user management also on this channel. Starting off from the organization main menu where we left off, click the Users menu item. Then click the plus icon in the Users section. Once the form loads, we'll input the user's name and email address, and then create the user by clicking the Save button. Once Ava's account is created, we'll authorize her to perform the human resource role. Click Permission Sets from the Authorization section of the User menu, and click the plus icon in the search bar and select and add the Company Administrator, Job Manager, and User Manager permission sets. This will enable her to manage the company, teams, users, and jobs in the organization. Next, we'll add a user whose role will be to authorize the users that Ava creates. I'll speed this up, since you've just seen me do this before. Once Gerald's account is created, we'll authorize him to perform the authorization role. Click Permission Sets from the Authorization section of the User menu, and then add the User Authorization permission set. You don't need to worry that Gerald can grant himself superpower privileges. Mercenta prevents him from authorizing himself. Those 2 users will receive a welcome email from Mercenta. Now that those 2 users are created and authorized to perform their respective roles, we don't need the User Manager permission set anymore. Click Administrators from the Modules section of the Organization menu, and click the menu item for My Name, Will, in the Administrators section. Then click Permission Sets in the Authorization section. When the form loads, I'll search, select and remove the User Manager permission set. Notice that although I can revoke permissions, I can't grant permissions to myself. That was the final topic in our tutorial, but before you leave, I'd like to quickly recap the topics we covered. I started out by looking at our organization's basic data, which was set up when the organization was registered, and considered the impact of changing the organization's subdomain. I then turned our attention to perhaps the most important job of the organization administrator, security. We broke this down into 2 areas, authentication and authorization, and then explored each in some depth. I skipped over themes, billing and data storage because these features haven't been released yet. Finally, I attended to the critical task of creating the initial users who will bootstrap the organization. I explained the differences between users and administrators, the types of users that you'll need, and a quick overview of good corporate governance practices, followed up with a demonstration. We certainly covered a lot of material, but by now you should be able to start administering your organization. Don't hesitate to reach out to us at support@mercenta.com if anything is still unclear or you need any help. Thank you.